with me, Samuel Kojo Brace, and Professor Audrey Gadzekpo. She is a professor at the Department of Communication Studies, University of Ghana. Prof, once again, great to have you here. It's really an honor to moderate this with you.
Thank you. I'm really also very honored to be here to moderate with you.
Let's start off. I'm going to start with you because you have a lot of knowledge in this field that we have to tap into. Let's look at the history of to start this discussion. Let's look at the history of newspaper, for example, because we know the effect the newspapers had during the struggles for independence, when they were publishing the letters of Kwame Nkrumah and all the messages that whipped up interest. But you know more. How was it like?
Well, newspapers started with the governor at the time, so the colonial government in 1823, I think it was, 1822. Mm-hmm. And that first newspaper had a very long, very officious name, the Royal Gold Coast Gazette and Commercial Intelligencer.
Hey.
And so Governor Sir Charles McCarthy set up that newspaper, and it was meant for the expatriate community. It wasn't meant for us at all. So you see that the contents of that newspaper were arrivals on the colony, what the ships brought, and news that were geared towards them. However, it went defunct 2 years later, we think, and I think it's because Sir Charles McCarthy got killed.
Replaced. Okay.
No, killed. Killed in the war against the Ashantis. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lacuna for a while. Then the next batch of newspaper production started. And it started with Ghanaians, Gold Coasters, indigenous people starting their newspaper. Bannerman started the Accra Herald, later called the West Africa Herald. The first was handwritten, 300 or so copies, you can imagine.
Wow.
And then they started to print it. And that started a tradition of indigenous people seizing the newspaper space. So then we had three types of newspapers. There were the indigenous people publishing newspapers, and a lot of the nationalists began to start and own newspapers or edit newspapers. Then there was the missionaries also. So there's a little bit of Christian newspaper publication. The Methodist Times, for example, by a very Pan-Africanist or nationalist priest editor, Ato Ahoma, and then Ato Ahoma, yes, and then there was the sporadic attempts by the colonialists to start newspapers, and that did not hold sway. So I think that when you look at newspapers pre-colonial, pre-independence era, you're looking at the rich corpus of newspapers that the nationalists started. From J.E. Casely Hayford to Brew to J.B. Dankwa. J.B. Dankwa had the first daily newspaper, the Times of West Africa, in 1930, early 1930s. I can't remember the exact date, and then so it was much later that the Nkrumah came in with the Accra Evening News. But before Nkrumah, all of these nationalists, the Kwate Papafios, Mensa Saba, all the big names that you can think of, they were involved in newspaper production, newspaper editing. It was a vocation for them. They had their day jobs, but they were passionate because it was the outlet from which they could express dissent. They could assert our nationalism, in their pages, and really oppose British colonial rule in their own way. And then, of course, leading up to independence, you had again a flurry of newspaper activity. Nkrumah had a number of newspapers in his stable, and the Accra Evening News was the leading one, and that galvanized the struggle, whatever was in the Accra Evening News, the slogans particularly became the slogans on the street, and that sort of thing. And women were involved in newspaper production. So the Accra Evening News had Mabel Davdankwa as one of its editors. So they were way ahead of the pack. And then one of Nkrumah's newspapers was the Takrady Times.
Okay.
And again,
we had a Takrady Times.
You had
newspaper.
a Takrady Times.
Oh.
You had a Cape Coast paper as well, and then you had Accra Evening News. Okay, and Ifwa Skeg, her brother Saki Skeg was in prison. He was editing the newspaper. She took over and continued the newspaper until he came out of jail.
Okay.
So there's a very rich history there.
Interesting. So Prof has laid the foundation for us. Let me bring in Dr. Charles Wereko-Brobby here. Doc, you also are someone who really understands the media landscape of this country. Professor Gadzekpo has really brought us the history of newspapers. How was the structure of the media during the pre-colonial times, during the independence? So the pre-independence time, during independence, and post. How was the structure then and during independence?
Before independence and right up to the end of the Third Republic, the media, at least us, represented by broadcasting, was very much under governmental control. So the government decided what you needed to hear and how you would hear it. And that, for me, was part of the problem, which ensured that the first three republics did not last for too long, because there was no avenue or event for alternative or other views. And I think in the end, when people got frustrated, they used the military as an instrument to get rid of government.
So, Prof, how was the role of the media then, really? Dr. Charles Wereko-Brobby, so the question is to you. Sorry, I gave you a Prof.
Yeah.
But so I want to understand how the role of the media was back then.
I explained to you the media was a tool for government propaganda and for government to tell you the world as it saw it, and not as you independently thought about it or given any opportunity to give your views as to how things were going. So it was very much a government propaganda tool. Oh. I'm sure Professor Gadzekpo would be more able to elaborate it in more intellectual terms. But for me, it was, even though we claim to be a republic, the media, because it was still the monopoly of the state, was very much a tool for government propaganda.
That is true, Professor Dr. Wereko-Brobby. I'm following. I think that you're absolutely right in describing the nature of the media post-independence and for long periods in our history. But I also think before we get to the post-independence era, or maybe in the immediate independence era, we will see that there was a lot of vision and thought that went into the role the media ought to play in a larger pan-African agenda. And perhaps we need to bring Professor A.C. Sutherland, Addy, to the conversation. She's a professor of African studies and a Pan-Africanist activist, to perhaps share with us some of the thoughts on the role that media, generally speaking, because you could include books as a form of media as well, and literary production played in the run-up to elections to independence, I beg your pardon, and immediately nation building period after
After independence.
independence. So, Prof,
Good morning.
good morning.
Happy Independence. Whatever it is, we should still know that we're celebrating something today. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I was looking through some of your work and others, that clearly demonstrated that people who were involved in journalism were using it for a anti-colonial for the anti-colonial struggle, and because of course they had to be perhaps cautious. It's very interesting the way that they wrote, a lot of satire, and some of the people that you've highlighted in your work, Epia Sabia and Labeled of Dankwa, using, that they're as columnists. I mean, I suppose if we were to compare them to somebody, we might compare them a little bit to Kwesi Anka of today. But you had that kind of writing, and they also, as you said, did make room for people who were writing literary works, which I'm very grateful for, because I mean you serialized the writings of a number of people, including Mabel Dampa that one has mentioned. I was also interested in what happened in the Nkrumah era, because yes, it was as if the attitude to journalism was almost duplicating the colonial attitude, which was to use the media definitely to put across, the policies of those who were ruling. But I found interesting some of the institutions that had been set up. For example, the Ghana News Agency, which was set up to counter the portrayal of Africans by the European media. I thought that was very interesting. And then our external service set up, which was supposed to be broadcasting in English, Hausa, Portuguese, French, Swahili, Arabic. I mean, that kind of broad vision of the role of Ghana itself in helping to liberate the continent and putting a certain face of Ghana across. I thought those were very interesting developments. So I suppose I should end here so that others can take up the discussion.
Yes, and you're absolutely right, and I'm really glad you highlighted the fact that during the Nkrumah era, it was very important for him to expand media in very interesting ways. He expanded media locally in order that the reach of radio, for example, could extend beyond what the colonial radio had set up, but then also the external radio to support other countries that Professor Sutherland Addy mentioned, to support other countries fighting for independence. So it had a reach in African countries, particularly West African countries, but beyond fighting for independence. GNA, she mentioned, was really important, and Nkrumah made sure that we had bureaus in all the major cities around the world, so that we could have our own wire service, okay? Then Nkrumah, in 1965, introduced television because we didn't have television before, and we were one of the first countries in West Africa to have television service. He had the wife of W.E.B. Du Bois, Shirley Du Bois, to superintend over the process, and and again, so we had a very rich media environment then. But on the negative side, the media was also controlled.
Yeah.
As Dr. Wereko-Brobby said, it became
government
a
propaganda.
tool for government propaganda. The media during the Nkrumah time also was the most repressed, because there were laws also. Some colonial era laws that were used to control the media. So holdovers were used, and new laws like the PDA could be used against journalists.
But
Then, importantly, in 1950 there was a Daily Graphic, which was a commercial. It was the first sort of commercial newspaper. But after independence, Nkrumah set up the first state-owned newspaper, which was the Ghanaian Times, 1958. And then the state bought the Daily Graphic, so it became a state-owned newspaper as well. And then when you think that radio and television were state monopolies, you can see how very controlled the media space was at that time. It was expanded for all kinds of good reasons and supported with production. Like we had the Akasanomar radio, for example, and we had the Sanyo assembling plant as well. So very good things happened in the media space, but also not so good things happened.
How did the ownership of these media play into how the media ended up in those times? Because the state ended up buying every other media such that then the state controlled it.
Well, yes. So that's why the media in the First Republic, the media environment was very monopolistic. It was a state monopoly, a virtual state monopoly. Still, some private newspapers were allowed to operate, but they were a shadow of their old self. For example, the Ashanti Pioneer, because there were censors, there were government censors there to make sure that they didn't publish anything that would upset the government. But perhaps we need to bring Dr. Wereko-Brobby also in, because, post-independence and post-Nkrumah, there were developments in the country that also sort of shaped the media landscape. And he may want to reflect on that. And then we'll come to the Fourth Republic, which is perhaps the most exciting of all.
So Dr. Brobby, would want to understand, building on from where we left off. Prof made it clear that, there were some other things that contributed to how the media behaved in those times. After the Nkrumah time, during those times, and immediately after him, there were some development that helped in building the media to the point where it got to. And you probably have some reflection to do on that.
Nkrumah was the First Republic, Busia was second, and I believe Lima was third. And the common thread in the First Republic was that the media was a monopoly largely, at least broadcasting media, which for a population largely not formally trained to read, was most accessible. So never mind the positive things that the government tried to do in terms of promoting our culture and Pan-Africanism and etc. It was still the view of the government. And in a republic being a democracy of the people holding power to account, you simply cannot have a system where the media is monopolized and controlled by the incumbent government. And so really, for me, as a child of all the public, we had democracy on paper, but in practice, once we had elections, the incumbent government did its best to control the media. Professor Gadzekpo talked about Cecil King's Daily Mirror, which was the first independent or privately owned newspaper in Ghana. But after independence, the government quickly seized control of it, and even then established its own national newspaper, the Ghanaian Times. So I really think that the media in Ghana for the first three republics were not developed to support the idea of Republican democracy. And so I really can't say more than that.
But I think, Dr. Wereko-Brobby, you're quite right. The media under the First Republic had a bit of a different mission, a Pan-Africanist mission, and a nationalistic mission, but not a mission to support democracy.
See, I agree with you. But it had that because of what Nkrumah's vision was.
Yes.
It wasn't something that developed independently outside of Nkrumah's view of colonialism and Africa and their capability to manage our own affairs. It also rolled into it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. And I kind of like the point you made that at the time, the media was not intended to support democratic development and growth, largely defined. But I also think that perhaps we need to remember, post Nkrumah, after Nkrumah, we had a coup in February 1966.
Yeah.
And for the most part, from that period, right up to, I would say, 1992, we were mostly under military rule. There were short periods of democratic rule, the Bouzia regime and the Liman regime, but they were short-lived. So really, we might want to look at media in those periods under the military. And I would invite Professor Sutherland, Addy, to share her reflections on the media during those moments of military regime.
Right, thank you very much. I think that the media was repressed, and so you did. There was very little, room for dissent. I mean, it wasn't to be tolerated, at all. What I and especially, of course, having been, served in the PNDC, I mean, one was very much aware that this type of the use of the media to propagate, a very strong bent towards what was claimed to be a revolution and so on, meant that the people who had liberal tendencies, found it extremely suffocating. And it's not surprising that some of the greatest rebellion against that kind of repression was to be found at in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But I would say that I was looking at a situation where it would appear that, like with many of our institutions, we kind of stuck, to what we had inherited from colonialism, really, and I believe that the idea that the media was to be used as part of the state's assets, tools for governance was very clear in those times. But I wouldn't also say that, even in the moments of democratic or maybe constitutional rule, we still didn't have that attitude. Also, I would like us to, and I would want to wonder about things like, the professionalism and so on that came about with the funding that was provided by the state in creating some of our best journalists actually came, out of GBC and so on. I would want us to think about that as well. So yes, the military regimes were definitely, part of their repression was the repression of the media. But again, let us also think about, how the media evolved, maybe in spite of the repression of those periods.
All right, grateful. We are still discussing how the media has evolved over the years, how the media has helped in shaping up the democracy that we do have in this country. I'm in studio with Professor Audrey Gadzekpo, who is professor at the Department of Communication Studies, University of Ghana. On the line, we have Dr. Charles Wereko-Brobby, Chief Policy Analyst, Ghana Institute of Public Policy Options. And we have Professor A.C. Sutherland, Addy, Professor of African Studies and Pan-African activist there on the line. So, Prof, let's come to the Fourth Republic and look at how, the media is. For you and what you know, how has been the media in this republic?
Well, the Fourth Republic has totally changed the media landscape. We've been looking at the evolution, and we've seen how at different points in our history before the Fourth Republic, there was always that monopoly and state control. Now, one of the things that happened as a prelude to democracy was, of course, our Constitution. And there's a whole chapter 12 in our Constitution devoted to the media. It was as though the framers decided we learned lessons from the past, and we don't want to repeat those mistakes. We want the media to be unimpeded so that they can hold government accountable. They can really play the variety of roles that we expect media to play in a democracy. So the Constitution was there, and that shaped, the trajectory of media immediately following. One, of course, of the most overt things was, and the questions on the table was, what will happen to state monopoly of radio? And I'm really glad that Dr. Wereko-Brobby is on the line. So I'll let him tell his story. But just imagine that before the Fourth Republic, were you to walk into GBC, you will see a militarized broadcasting facility. There were the soldiers, there were the sandbags, there was the outlook post. Why? We forget that if somebody was writing a manual how to prosecute a successful coup in Ghana, and we had 5 over the period, it would be to say you must first seize GBC. So GBC was a military zone, okay? Today, when we walk into GBC, we don't see any of those things, and that for me is a powerful signal of the change. But the most important, quite aside from the fact that the newspaper licensing laws that were in place before the Fourth Republic were repealed as a condition to our first democratic elections that ushered in the Fourth Republic. And so it opened up the media space because, as was said, during the military period, the media space was really very constrained, and the PNDC was the last military government we had. In fact, by the time before the newspaper licensing law was repealed, the only newspapers really were the state-owned newspapers, you know, and then there were the lotto sheets, then there were the sports papers, because newspapers as we know it, no, they weren't licensed, or they were hounded out of business, okay, largely. And then the Fourth Republic came, newspapers started to flourish again. They call them the mushroom newspapers. Why? Because they seem like mushrooms. Newspapers were springing up all over the place. You know, private newspapers were springing up, mushrooming. We'll talk about their performance later. And then there was a question of what to do with radio. And at first, the government was very reluctant to open up the airwaves. So over to you, Dr. Wereko-Brobby. This is your chance to tell us the story of
Audrey,
breaking state monopoly.
interesting thing is that the Third Republic is provisions for free and independent media was exactly what was put in the Fourth Republican Constitution. And indeed, they trace the whole thing back to the Second Republican Constitution as well. So it wasn't that media was not seen to be, or was not expected to be free and independent. It was the fact that what was written on paper quickly disappeared into thin air once the incumbent government took office in both the Second and Third Republics, because it needed people to make real what was on paper. And you know, Audrey, that under the constitutional chapter on freedom and independence of the media, it stated very clearly that you can establish a medium of mass communication, the key phrase, without license. And even now, even though it's very clear in the Constitution, people still talk about licensing. For us, if you did not actually move to make real what was written in the Constitution and was waiting for government to open up the media, it was never going to happen, because we had clear experiences of that. So the genesis for Radio I was to say that, look, if the Constitution says I can establish an independent or private radio station, why don't you just, without license, why don't you just go ahead as intended and simply do so? So, of course, you could not do so without letting the authorities know. So the difference between what we did and what had happened before was that we simply informed the authorities that under the Constitution we can establish a station, and so we are moving to do so, and we'll be operating on such and such a frequency. The difference was not to wait for the authority to give you permission, because all attempts previously had proved futile. You would not believe it that even under Supreme Military Council, free media was on paper permitted. This was when Commissioner Frey was the Commissioner for Information, and he wrote the SMC Decree 71, which actually stipulated that you could have free media and a military regime, but it never, of course, materialized. So the impetus for Radio I was that let's make real what the Constitution intends, and then let's see how the authority responds to that move. Hitherto, what had happened was that people who seek permission, and bureaucratic ways will be found to ensure that it was never provided. So if you then went to court, the case will get stuck in court forever. Our Constitution said that it's only when you didn't understand the clear language of the Constitution in any of its provisions that you seek interpretation from the Supreme Court. So for us, the issue was we clearly understood the provisions of Article 1632. It didn't need anybody else to tell us what to do. And that was the genesis of Radio I. We knew and we hoped that once you started broadcasting pluralism, there will be an attempt by government either to clamp down or to seek to control the narrative of how multimedia or plural media would develop. And this is really what happened. And the government moved very quickly to see whether it could control the development of private radio by, in effect, seeking to license the development, first with Joy, then with Gold, then with, I think there was a third one, which was, but they were all licensed, even though the clear language was that there should be no license. So we have a situation in Ghana now where the media is very free, is very plural, it is owned very privately, but it's still controlled by government. And so we have freedom of the media, but not independence of the media. But the fact that there are so many stations that we're able to, in effect, share ideas and give our views independently of what government wants to say. And it's interesting that Audrey talked about the army no longer being a JBC, because there are now 350 platforms you have to take over if you wanted to stage a coup instead of the only one. So it's superfluous whether you guard it or don't guard it. But that's a brief history of what it is. We can then move on.
Yeah, and I like the fact that it almost sounds oxymoronic when you say we have freedom of the media is pluralistic, but we don't have independence of the media. And perhaps we need to bring Professor A.C. Sutherland Addy in at this point to reflect on whether she thinks, in fact, people say, is the media truly pluralistic? We may have a lot of media outlets, but is there pluralism in the media? And is there independence in the media? Prof.
Thanks. Yeah, that's it's a point that I've been reflecting on for a while. I would recall being on the National Media Commission, the first one under Professor Kumado. There was, we had a lot to think through, and one of them was really, for example, whether religious bodies and political, bodies, parties, and so on, or or highly politically exposed people should own media, and there was a very strong feeling that these two kinds of entities would actually create a situation where the media was being, controlled by some very, very strong, partisan or ideologically, very, very highly, ideologically oriented institutions and personalities. And I mean, I wish, probably colleagues on this call, on this program could comment on that, because that for us was a major worry, and it seems to me that we are reaping some kind of some results from the situation where we should really look at who currently owns these media stations, particularly the radio stations and maybe even television, and see what's happening there, because I think it's a very, very interesting situation, and we should find out whether this in fact is harming, or holding us back from the ideals that we set out, with having a pluralistic media. and then, so the independence of the media, also the commercial impetus. I mean, there is no way in which this wouldn't have happened, of course. And the thing is to examine whether commercial, in the interest of being businesses, whether the media are in fact independent of the requirements of being of commercial interest. What I think perhaps shows this up a lot is also the whole idea of is there room within this for public radio, for example, or public television, and what the way in which people are saying, GTV or also the radio stations under the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation have lost, a lot of their audiences has to do with the fact that they have not been able to keep up those broad areas of interest that they had, and who's going to take care of that part of informing people about things that are not necessarily commercially viable. And so I wonder about the balance, and I feel that we should look therefore at political interests, religious interests, commercial interests, and how those are shaping, if you like, the media landscape, because those are things that seem to stand out.
Prof, that's an interesting point.
Yes.
Okay, I think Dr. Wereko-Brobby wants to make a point briefly.
I wanted to comment on Professor Ace's contribution. All the issues you've raised, I think, are to be answered, or we don't have answers because of lack of a modified broadcasting law. I say broadcasting law because we already have one which really deals with the monopoly situation of the GBC. But as Audrey and I have been involved with getting a proper broadcasting law in this country to guide the development of multi-broadcasting and multi-radio stations. But unfortunately, the whole thing is still under government control, because the NCA, which is a quasi-government organization under a minister, has somehow hijacked the role of deciding who should have a radio station, even though the Constitution is very clear and established the NMC that he served under to be the body that should regulate broadcasting in Ghana. Since 1994, when John Mahama was Deputy Minister of Information, the government tried or claimed to set up various bodies over the years that has tried to develop a broadcasting law. Indeed, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, we got very close to actually developing a draft law. I think it was 2016. But under the current, and nothing has happened. So we need a broadcasting law to regulate media in Ghana and deal with all the issues that we have raised about political ownership, religious bodies, and whether they should run their own stations, and content development, what should be Ghanaian, what should not, what we should allow. But it's interesting that the Minister of Information at the time that we tried to break the monopoly, to be called Mr. Azan. That's where it came from. But unfortunately, he and other politicians...
But let me just add to what he said, because before we go on our next commercial break. And it's to say that even as recent as a year or two ago, the issue of the broadcast bill, which has been there is a broadcast bill. It needs to be finessed. There was a stakeholder engagement led by the Minister for Information, and they promised that they will table the broadcast bill before Parliament. We're still waiting. There are all kinds of excuses that are being made, including the fact that technology has taken over, and so the bill has to be revamped. But there is need to clarify, how we want our broadcasting space to develop, and how to hold people accountable. And so it is a work that, and a promise through various governments that remains unfulfilled.
How soon should that happen? Just a minute.
We need it. I mean, we should have had it before.
How soon is yesterday?
Yes, because it's almost as though the horses have bolted out of the stable, and now you want to close the door, and so we really need to look at it with the urgency that it deserves.
Interesting. You're still listening to the Super Morning Show. We're talking about the role and the impact of the media, pre-independent, post, and now, and we're going to look into the future. We've spoken about how the media has been in the Fourth Republic, the fact that the media ownership is a bit problematic, and therefore we need a new media law, which has been promised to be laid in Parliament but has not. Okay, Prof, now it is big, it is mega, celebrating a decade of touching lives and inspiring many across Africa and beyond through music. Celebrating a decade of God's goodness, Celestial Praise 10 is here. Ministering Pastor Jervis Jokoto, Irene Logan, MOG, Nana Yao Asari, PSA Esther, Obapa Christie, Evelyn Wanjiru from Kenya, and NK Ogboruche from Nigeria. Host is Celestine Donko. Theme is a new season, and it's today, Monday, 6th March 2023, at 4 p.m. at the Dominion Sanctuary Victory Bible Church, Awoshi, here in Accra. Rate for regular is 60 cedis, double is 100 cedis, and for VIP is also 100 cedis. For ticket, dial *447 *1762 #. Sponsors include L Time Properties, Dunu Restaurant, ATL Fabrics, Tank Palace Hotel, Oheza Studios, K-Mod Fabrics, and Cheesy Pizza, empowered by Joy Entertainment.
Well, Kojo, the first edition of Institute of Chartered Accountants Ghana, ICAG, 60th Anniversary's public lecture is scheduled for 9th March 2023 from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. The topic for the lecture is Financial Reporting Implications under the Ghana Domestic Debt Exchange Program. The Institute cordially invites the general public to join a live streaming session via Facebook, Twitter at ICAGH1, LinkedIn at ICAGH Faculty, and YouTube at Virtual ICAG.
Interesting. Now let me take you to the University of Ghana campus, where, as a prelude to the inaugural lecture to be delivered by Professor Charity Sylvia Akotia, former Dean, School of Social Sciences, on Thursday, March 9th, 2023, the University of Ghana Library System is organizing an exhibition of her academic publications from Tuesday, March 7th, which is tomorrow, 2023, to Friday, March 10, 2023, at the Balm Library. The opening ceremony of the exhibition will be on Tuesday, which is tomorrow, at 2:30 p.m. prompt at the Balm Library Seminar Room. Chairman will be Professor Daniel Frimpong Ofori, Provost, College of Humanities. The UGLS and the University of Librarian have the pleasure of inviting members of the university community and the public, the general public, to the ceremony. Please find attached. Okay, so that's what it is. I mean, it is tomorrow at the Balm Library Seminar Room at 2:30 p.m.
Great. And guess what? Manifest is coming to UG.
Hey.
Yes. So join the UG at 75 Trail to host Manifest in a conversation about Ghana's creative economy and its opportunities for our future. And the event is today, Independence Day, 6 March 2023.
Oh.
It's at 5 p.m. So get ready to go to the CD Conference Center at the University of Ghana. And it will be hosted by Akosia Hansen. And the vibe, relaxing, engaging, impactful, and who knows, it could also be lyrical.
Yeah.
So see you all there.
And I can see you're excited by this.
I am absolutely excited.
Oh, okay. Now, once you are, let's talk about the future of media. From where you sit, how do you see the future of Ghana's media?
The future of Ghana's media is challenging. Challenging because of certain things that have been alluded to in this conversation already, stemming from the past. For example, it's very worrying that, one, there's no broadcast law, but importantly also, there's a certain political and religious capture of the media. If you were to have a study, well, Media Foundation for West Africa had one quite a few years ago, but if you were to repeat that study today, you see the number of politicians or political actors or political proxies who own media in Ghana. Then, of course, much of the media landscape is commercial, and we haven't developed public media enough. GBC is our de facto public media.
Yeah.
It needs to be supported so that, as Professor A.C. Sutherland Addy said, you know, it would feel confident enough not to compete with commercial stations.
But we also
so
have
that
the community radio stations.
Yes, and I'll come to that. But it's very important for GBC to be capacitated, so they'll do the kinds of programs that are needed, but that are not commercially viable. Very, very important for them to be able to do that, and they just don't get enough funding, and so sometimes they feel the need to put on commercial programs that would draw in audiences in order to draw in advertisers, because that's how the media works. Then there's a community radio. There's quite a few, but there's too many radio stations that are not community masquerading as community radio stations. And community radio is from the bottom up. So you need the communities to be involved. It's not that the MP or the district assembly or somebody owns the radio station, because it's still, as Professor Wereko-Brobby has alluded to, means that it's in political hands. It becomes a state monopoly when you have these political actors in there. So the future is challenging in that way. You know, the future is also challenging in terms of sustainability, because we live in a new media age.
Yes.
Where there's social media, where there's online media, drawing the traditional base of where traditional media get money from, which is advertising. And so as more and more advertising moves online, then traditional media is challenged. How do we support our operations? You know, and when media, and we know it in this country, when media is not supported properly and they pander to the, shall I say, common interest, and they are guided by strong commercial interests, then the product, the content of the media becomes a problem. Sometimes it is not professional enough. It's sensational because they know that will draw audiences. They cannot train their personnel well enough because they don't have enough money to do that training, so that we have real professional people and content on in the media. They don't fact check, you know, etc., etc.
Okay, very important point you've made there, Dr. Wereko-Brobby. You've been involved in media for some time now. In the next minute or two, what will be your proposal as well as to how we can shape the media for what it is supposed to do going into the future?
Well, first of all, we need to depoliticize the media. By that I mean that we should take it away from direct government control and give it back to the NMC to regulate. that means that the NCA law must be modified so that the decision as to who gets to establish a radio station is not in the hands of the Minister of Communications, but is in the hands of the National Media Commission. Then issues as to ownership, whether religious people can own, politicians can own, all those things need to be taken away from government control and given back to the National Media Commission, which by constitution is what is supposed to regulate media in Ghana. Once we can do that, then we need to have the NMC work with government to get an appropriate broadcasting law which takes cognizance of the new media, of social media and internet, etc. And how do you regulate something that nobody needs anybody's permission to establish a broadcasting medium on the internet? But all the issues of, if you like, quality, etc., will come when there's proper regulation.
Okay.
Without proper regulation, we have a free-for-all where people will do as they please. We don't have anybody looking at training. We don't have anybody looking at professionalism. We don't have anybody looking at content because there's no law. So I think the first two things we need to do going forward is that, yes, we now have plenty of radio stations, but the plenty is not enough. We now need to talk about quality, professionalism, and training, and making sure that people don't misbehave just by going for the lowest common denominator of what titillates themselves.
Great, thank
So
you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wereko-Brobby. We are almost out of time. So the last word goes to Professor A.C. Sutherland. Addy, if you had one or two quick things to say about the future of media, perhaps one, what would it be?
Well, okay, let me just say that I agree with everything that the two of you have said. But I think that we should strive for self-regulation within the media landscape so that we don't have to have a situation where somebody else is looking over the media with a stick. I think that would be particularly important. Some kind of intentionality where work is being done actively to ensure that some of the things that we're talking about really take place, and that we should also remember that we are not alone in this world where the new media is pushing the mainstream media to look for ways to improve the way that they hold the attention of the public. But I think the last thing I want to say is that if we're having pluralism, there should be room also for public media, and room for the government to also have a say in what is happening, because at the end of the day, we are government, and government is us, and we need to communicate in some kind of a way. So I think that given the time, those would be the things that I would say.
Very grateful for your thoughts there. So that's Professor A.C. Sutherland Addy there sharing her thought. We're grateful to Dr. Wereko-Brobby for joining as well, and then Professor Audrey Gadzekpo. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, Kojo. It was a pleasure.
And an honor on my part too to have done this with you. So all too soon we have to draw the curtain here. It's been an interesting conversation. I'm sure that will continue some other time, but you can go onto our social media page and have the entire discussion there if you joined in late. We're grateful.